Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we are going to be reading through and translating a poem contained in this fascinating book from the 17th century, which is called Runica Danica Literatura Antiquissima, which means, Runic or Danish literature most ancient, said to be Gothic in the common tongue, which was edited by Ola Worm, and we're going to talk a little bit now quickly about who he is. So he was a Danish antiquarian living in the 1500s and 1600s. I believe he died 1654. This is a portrait, I believe, from life of him with his wife Dorothea Worm. And he is one of the very earliest antiquarians that we have. And among other things which he is famous for, he had this sort of cabinet of curiosities, which you can see here, where he incorporated artifacts and objects from all around the world, and people sometimes credit it as a proto-museum. The contender for the world's earliest museum is either Ola Worm's Cabinet of Curiosities from Denmark, or it is the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but it's an open question as to which one is the first. Let me know in the comments which one you think is the first if you have an opinion on it. Now, what we're going to be looking through in this video is a poem which he says was sent to him by a man called the very reverend and most educated man, Olaf the Great, the pastor of a church called Laufasiensis. And it's pretty difficult to pick apart the Latin. I can't honestly tell you where that is, but it says that he is from the north of Ireland, ex Islandia Boreali. So this is a poem which was sent to the editor of this volume, Olaf Worm, by his friend Olaf of Laufasiensis. And this is the poem which we see here on the screen. Now, Ola Worm edited this poem, reproduced it here, and then he wrote a gloss in Latin, letting us know what the poem means. But there are a couple of areas where Ola Worm seems to have made a few mistakes, not fully understood the sort of medieval Icelandic that's being recorded here, because bear in mind, modern Icelandic itself is not completely unintelligible with Old Norse of the 1300s, and this poem itself is only being written in the 1500s or 1600s. So the Icelandic of Olaf from Laufasiensis is probably not drastically different from the Old Norse of the 1300s, which is our sort of standard Old Norse that we have today, which most students will learn in classes. But Ola Worm is a Dane from the late 1500s, early 1600s, so he doesn't necessarily know Icelandic all that well, and he makes a couple of mistakes which are quite interesting to see. There are also some things which might be simple typing errors, but which are quite amusing. But we can see from this what Olaf thought the poem meant, or what Ola Worm thought the poem meant, and I think it's quite fun to have a read through this poem and see what it is. The book in general, Danish Antiquities, the Runic Antiquities, is quite an interesting book. Among other things, Ola Worm is very fond of printing texts of the Poetic Edda, or quotes from the Poetic Edda, in runes rather than the Latin script, even though all of our manuscripts to the present day of this are in the Latin alphabet rather than the runic script. So Ola Worm is transliterating these texts, sometimes incorrectly, by the way, into runes just for this sort of rule of cool purpose, which I can't really blame him because runes are pretty cool. But it's an interesting book nonetheless. Perhaps, hypothetically, Ola Worm was working from runic manuscripts of the Poetic Edda, which have since been lost to us, but I find that highly unlikely, given that, the runic manuscripts that we do know of are quite diligently noted in the historical records. So, this is my gloss of the poem itself, and if you want to have a go at translating it on your own, feel free to do so. And at the end, I'll show you not only my translation, but a normalization of it into sort of standard Old Norse as best I was able to do, because this is sort of Old Icelandic from the 1600s and it's a little bit different. And there's one or two things which seem a little bit off. So have a go, pause the video and translate this on your own. And I'm not actually going to take you through this right now in the standard format like we do for the tidbits. I'm actually going to take you through Ola Worm's explanation of what this poem actually means, because we get so much insight into his thought process there, and it's quite an interesting process to do. So let's get on with that, although maybe first I will read out the poem aloud to you because it's pretty beautiful to listen to. So without further ado. Strauma mot og minnis, munna masti brunnur, gleði lands og gleða, lína bolits dinna, gratur himmins gátur, gledda forðok maður, lærða lista hýrðar, leiftu verki hreyfdi, reistu plengri ústad, reit megin húgvittur, ásteinum mitt still runa, ísta vilum gravit, valda vanda fyllra, veitek donskum sveitum, hagt hafa verkein doktor, virðik hann lofi hýrðin. Okay, so what do this first line mean? Strauma mot og minnis in this drotkvat poem. And if you want an explanation of what the drotkvat meter is, I'll put a link to Jackson Crawford's video on the Old Norse poetic forms in the description. So, strauma mot, he says, straumur is a sort of very strong flowing sea, which is mighty in its flowing and its in its flooding over and its retraction, basically, whose genitive plural is strauma, which means the flowings of the sea. So he's giving the Latin translation of strauma here. Mot means a sort of goal or an ending point. Now, this isn't strictly true. It's in Old Norse, the word mot is more like a meeting, but it's close enough here. Whence, he says, you have the verb ad matast, which means to place an end on something. And I think the words might be connected etymologically, meta and moat in Old Norse, but don't quote me on that. So he might not be too wrong, Ola Worm, in his explication here. And this is where it gets quite interesting. Mimer est nomen proprium monstrasi quisdam viri, quis meminit edda. So Mimer is the name of a particular monstrous man whom the Edda makes mentions of. It is said indeed that he possesses the font of wisdom. Now, of course, this is a Old Norse god, but Ola Worm being a staunch Christian and also possibly taking literally Snorri Sturluson's interpretation that the Old Norse gods are simply former humans who, through their deeds, became glorified over the centuries. Ola Worm seems to be taking that conclusion quite literally, and so he's saying that Mimer is the name of a sort of monstrous man, which is an interesting way of looking at the gods. The monstrosity probably being an influence of Ola's Christianity. But in this case, quite clearly, Mimer is standing in for the concept, which, oh goodness, there's a term for this in classical literature, in the same way that in Latin sometimes the word Mars, meaning the god of war, can sometimes just be a stand-in for war itself. Here, he literally says it is understood as a symbol for the matter itself, in this case, a fountain. And thus it's a synecdoche, that's it. It's a stand-in for whichever fountain you want. So the meaning of this, he says, strauma motuk minis, means the joining of the streams and of fountains in which the sea and rivers join together, which in our ancient language is called os. I believe is the case in Old Norse. And he says this letter in the runic alphabet denotes the letter O, which this line points towards. And that's why I wanted to take you guys through Ola Worm's discussion of the poem here, because every one of these lines, particularly in the first half of this poem, is a riddle which relies on a rather intricate knowledge of Old Norse mythology and literature, the answer to which spells out a name, the logos that we've got here. So the first line is giving us the letter O, so bear that in mind. And then we have the lines Munna masti brunna, which and he says Munnar is the mouth of the mouth, whose genitive plural is Munna. I'll be completely honest, I don't fully know what the mouth of the mouth is supposed to refer to here. But there we go. And this word is kind of curious. Muste here, which is mama, which he says it indicates waters flowing from fountains. But mama in Latin means a breast or a teat. And it's not even, the musti itself is not even from Latin. Mama is Latin, but muste is actually a Greek word which has been brought into the poem as a loan. But what's really curious is I don't fully understand why it's been brought in. At first I thought, okay, he's put masti in order to get the alliteration with munna. But the poem would still alliterate and have pretty much exactly the same meter if he used the Norse word briosti instead, so munna briosi brunnur. So I don't know why this Greek word is in here, quite frankly. It's a bit weird, basically. And he then goes on to say that brunnar means fountains. So therefore this line is saying a fountain from the breast of a mouth, namely from waters from the fountains, as, for example, you might get milk coming out of breasts which we suck with our mouths or we drink with our mouths. But we don't take this, however, from the sea. So he's saying the word musty here is being used to let us know that even though the last line above was about sort of the sea, because it referred to a meeting of the streams and the river or the estuary, this line is not referring to the sea, because you've got the word breasts here. So he says, therefore, nothing else is implied by these words than water flowing, which in the ancient language was called logur. And in the Runic alphabet, this has the letter L. So if you've been paying attention thus far, now we have the letters O and L, and the perceptive ones among you have probably guessed where this is going, but let's continue. So the next line reads, Gleði lands ok lida, which means the joy of the regions and of the people. And he reads this as the year. So that is the year, eternal and a sort of continued variety of times, which sort of delights the land and its inhabitants. I don't know. I find that's a really silly, I find that's a really silly explanation. Like what because right, the joy of the land and people. We're like, oh, like time changes for lands and people, therefore, bum bum bum. Like, what? There's no necessary connection. It's literally like that scene in Bob's Burgers where Linda's like, it's easy to remember our anniversary because it's 9-3. 9 is divisible by 3. And then Bob's like, a lot of numbers are divisible by 3. She should have said the square root, it's 3 squared or something, or 3 is the square root of 9. But anyway, the point is, the ancients called the year Or, which is spelled with the letter A. Okay, fine, let's just accept this. By the way, for this, I'm assuming, maybe incorrectly, I'm assuming that Ola has been given the key for this, or the answers to this, by his Icelandic friend. Otherwise, it would be curious if he's just like guessing these things on his own steam. But anyway, so thus far we have O, L, and A, referenced by the solution to each of these riddles in Old Norse. So then we get onto the lines Linna bolit stina. So this word I thought at first was actually incorrect, but then I found out he's just being a bit obscure and poetic. So lina est appellatio serpentis. Lina is a sort of a way of calling a serpent, and he sort of it like me. It's related to our English word line, and it means like rope and this kind of thing. So in an abstract metaphorical sense, you can see it referring to a snake. But at first I thought this was either incorrect or just an obscure word that we don't know of. But no, it's attested in Old Norse. And then bol is electus, and it is a word in Old Norse, it's just a bit obscure. And then stinnor, that means firm or immobile. So therefore, Lina bol is a bed of a snake taken for gold, in which dragons and serpents are said to lie. So, what's the word? It's basically the dragon's hoard is what this line is referring to, full of gold and treasures and all this lot. Which leads us in to his next, oh, this is such an obvious clue that you're supposed to figure out. He says, whence this word, you're supposed to understand this word as referring to treasures, which, I'm sorry, that's just, no. Unless the word Lina, like, in most contexts, refers to dragons, maybe it's just so bloody obscure. Like, who would read the line, like, a harsh bed of a serpent, and think, ah, yes, money. Like not just like coins or treasures, like the abstract concept of money, which is what the rune fehu means in Old Norse, or even cattle. That's another thing. Like the word can also mean cattle. It's just, it's awful, absolutely terrible. He says, which the ancients called fie, or like fehu, which in the Runic alphabet has the letter F. And then he gives the game away and he says, so therefore, if you add up the 4 letters from these verses above, you get the Old Norse words os, logur, ar, and fich, which results in the word Olaf. So there we go, lads. We have figured out the first, like part of this poem, the hidden message inside. What about the rest of it? So, gradur himens gautur. Now, notice here, some of these have odd spelling mistakes, and it's not fully clear what each of them are meant to mean. So, the runes on the page spell Guntur, but the Latin explanation gives Gautur, which is important, as we'll get to in a second. But I'm going to go with Gautur here just because it's what he is writing in his explanation. So he says that Gratur Himens means that tears of heaven or clouds of rain, which long ago were called Ur or Urfella, and therefore in the runic alphabet this would be spelled with the letter U. Now, yes, the letter Ur does in fact, the runic letter Ur is called Ur, so he's right on that one. Gautur, which is a flowing of water or of the river's mouths, is also called an os, and therefore it indicates the letter O. So we had a similar thing earlier with the letter O, where he says that the meetings of the sea and river is called a mouth in the ancient language, and we've got a similar thing here where he's like, the mouth of the rivers is therefore called a mouth, and therefore we're going to use the letter O. Fine, good enough. Let's just accept that. And then he says, glada for. He says, glada is the word for a horse. And yes, it's the word for a horse. It's the word specifically for a castrated horse, which is cognate to our English word gelding. And then for is a journey. So it therefore indicates the journey of a horse, which is called a reið, and that is the name of the runic letter R. I think this is a fair enough one. That's a nice riddle. And then lastly, maður, which is homo, which is given by the letter M. Yes, although he's using a cognate here, so like Old Norse is multiple words for a man or a person, but there's the word man and then maður, and he's used the other one here, and we're supposed to understand that maður is referring to the homonym of this word, which is man, because man is also the name of one of the runes. So that's what we get here. So adding all of those up, we get ur, os, reid, and man. And then from all of those, you get the word worm. So if you've been paying attention from the previous one, in the first 4 lines, add them up, we get the name Olaf. And the next 4 lines, we get the word worm. So there we go. And that's why these first few lines are kind of weird. Like with this, if you'll look at the gloss, there's no verb for these. It's just a list of different nouns, and it's a bit confusing. And then the next 2 lines are going to explain to us why that is the case. So we know that those lines have been for the purpose of spelling out Ola Worm's name, and now we're going to get to the sort of message of the poem itself, because now we've learned who it's dedicated to, which, quick note, I think it's very, very sweet that this man's friend, a pastor from Lufasiensis, sent Olaf a poem in Old Icelandic, which is made out to his name. I think that's sweet. So the next line of the poem reads, Lærðra lista hirða, which means a guardian of the educated arts. That is a doctor. Okay, fair enough. So this last line, which is sort of the last line of just nouns and adjectives, before we get on to the sort of passage with verbs and some more meat on the bones, this is just giving him his title. So 1, 2, 3, 4, these lines are spelling out Ola. 1, 2, 3, oh sorry, 1, 2, these lines are spelling out worm, and then this line here is just telling you his title of doctor. So Ola Worm Doctor, and then it says Leif du verki hreyfdi, which means he left behind this engraved work, which he says here is he's meaning to say he publicized this work, which up until now was known by nobody. Very exciting stuff. So then it goes on to say, reisi upp lengi rustad. Raise up means he sort of brought to the light, he published it. Rustad means a thing which is rusty and dwelling in dust. Now, I actually haven't really found an attestation in Old Norse corpus of this word rustav, which is probably sort of a past participle, meaning rustader, from some verb being like rustia, and probably cognate of our English word rusted or to rust, based on the description that Ola Worm is giving here of a thing which is red and covered in dust. And so then he says, Reit megin hugviter, and you can see that he's not sure whether it's an EI or just an I, so either way, we still get the message of it. Reit is a writing or a scriptum in Latin, and then we get this word Megan, which is one of the first times where I see his Old Norse understanding break down either a little bit, or maybe the priest even who sent this to him meant to say something else and Ola Worm has misunderstood it, because what I'm interpreting this here, and that's the reason I've glossed it in red, is as an adverbial accusative. And the reason for this is because Ola Worm is glossing this word as insignita, which means masterfully in Latin. But the problem is that adverbial accusatives in Latin, Gothic, and Old Norse and Old English, they usually take the neuter form of the adjective. Now, Megan in Old Norse means mighty or powerful, but that's the nominative masculine and feminine singular form. The neuter form would be megant, but we don't have that here, so it doesn't make sense otherwise. However, funnily enough, this word Megan isn't necessarily incorrect, but in terms of the grammar, it changes the meaning of the sentence, because if you have two, say, nominatives or two accusatives with a singular verb and no real conjoining word like og, you're supposed to read them in at least Latin, and I think also Gothic and probably Old Norse literature also, as equating of the two. So in this case, the Rustad Rit would be equated to his Megan, which would mean his power, because Megan is also a noun in Old Norse meaning might or power. So what this could mean is that he raised up this rusty writing as a manifestation of his power. But we can tell that Ola Worm didn't intend to say this, because he tells us that Megan is meaning something different. He's telling us that Megan is an adverb, but grammatically it can't function as an adverb according to the rules of Norse literature. So either he or the priest who sent him this has made a mistake there. There's a couple of other mistakes which are kind of curious. You can notice in the runes, this line begins with reisti, but he's sort of glossed it here as Leicester, which is a curious mistake. Maybe it's a typo of some sorts, and maybe he's thinking in terms of the Danish verb adlese, which is like to read. So this would mean he read up, which frankly doesn't make much sense. And reist up, not only does reist up make a lot more sense, but it's also a kind of word that you tend to get in authentic runic inscriptions from early medieval Scandinavia, because, you know, you'll have it saying so-and-so reisti þessi runa, you know, so-and-so wrote these runes for so-and-so. So it's very unlikely that any runestone would say Leicester, but there we go. And so we've covered this curious little grammatical mistake here, and then we have the adjective hugvitur, which means intelligent, basically, and he gives lots of alternative translations for that in Latin. So these two lines mean the intelligent man raised up for a long time this rusty writing as a manifestation of his power, or it could mean the wise man for a long time raised up this rusty writing powerfully. And then it says, Arstenum med stil runa. So on stones with the style of the runes. Stavvidum gravid. Now, I've not been able to find an Old Norse word like stavvidum, but it seems to mean something like with sort of with letters, basically, or with sort of the obscure things of letters. And then gravid is neuter, accusative, singular of the past participle gravin, and it is related to rit here. So it's he raised up the gravit rit, the engraved writing in sort of letters on stones with the style of runes. Now, this is an interesting thing. It makes me wonder if maybe somewhere in Iceland or in Denmark there might be a version of this very poem which has in fact been carved onto a runestone in memory of Ola Worm, which would be extremely cute if we were to find that. But none has been found that I know of. And so then we have this next line, which is a little bit difficult. Valla vanda fulra, which he translates as scarcely with more difficulty. But I don't think that this is actually what this means, just based on the sort of Old Norse here. My understanding of this is that Valha is related to Old Norse Varla, which means scarcely, and then Fulra Vanda. I think Fulra goes with Runa because they're both gender plurals, and this means sort of more filled. So the runes which are more full, and then the adjective full often takes a genitive, and then vanda is the genitive plural of twigs, basically. So full of twigs or of sticks, and that's of course referring to the jagged nature of runic writing. So this paragraph here means Reisio plengilus darret megin hugbitur astenum midstil runa I stavinum gravid valla vanda fillra, means he raised up for a long time, the intelligent man, this rusty writing masterfully on stones with the style of runes, engraved in letters, scarcely in the style of the runes which are full of twigs, is what this long little bit is saying. And then we are now almost at the end here. Vet eg av donskum svetum means I know or I have learned av donskum svetum from the Danish people. Vakt hava verk ein doktor. Now he gives his apologies here because I've hardly been able to find some doctor among the Danes to have raised up such a difficult work. So he's bragging a bit here, and he's also sort of apologizing for using the loan word doctor because there is no equivalent of somebody who has a PhD in Old Norse. So this here is an accusative infinitive construction. So I know from the Danish people, and then verbs of knowing, verbs of mind and mouth tend to trigger oblique speech, which means we've got this bit here. So ein doctor vakt hava. I know that a doctor has awoken the werk, the verk. And so a doctor from the Danish people has awakened a work. And then this last line I think is quite fun. Virdik han lovi hirden. And the grammar here is a little bit incorrect because you would need a particle in Old Norse. But what this means is, I will become him whom the people will praise. And I think in Old Norse proper this would be Verðeg han lovi hirden. But it's close enough, basically. So I know from the Danish people, a doctor has woken up this work. I will become him whom the people will praise. And there we go. This is the whole poem. So my translation of this poem from start to finish, and by the way, on the side here, you can see my normalization into standard Old Icelandic from the 1300s. My translation of it is: a meeting of streams and of the estuary, a wellspring from the mouth's breast, the joy of the land and peoples, a stiff bed of ropes, the weeping of heaven, the horse's journey, and a Gothic man who is the shepherd of more learned skills, all left behind the aforementioned work. For a long time the cunning man raised up ruddy writing on stones with the style of twig-filled runes engraved in staves. I know that a doctor from the Danish regions has awakened this work. I will become he whom the public praises. Because, of course, Ola Worm brags in his explanation that he doesn't think many Danish doctors would be able to write a runic poem of this kind. So he has to justify this rather braggadocious poem that he's included here. So he writes a little note at the end saying, I would hardly have thought it necessary to include this logograph written in the ancient style, unless my certain friends of mine had been demanding it and saying that it was absolutely necessary that I include this. So Ola Worm is like, oh no, my friends just insisted. I absolutely must include this this rune poem, which is praising the skill of this Danish doctor who, above all others, has been able to master the mysteries of these runes. It's amazingly fun stuff. And there we go. That is the poem by Ola Worm. I hope you've enjoyed going on this somewhat chaotic journey through a 17th century rune poem with me. So, If you want me to teach you Latin or any of the other languages that we do on this channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video, and there you can get tuition at lower than market rates. You can also join my Discord server, where I tend to post these glosses as images before I turn them into videos, and it's also a fun community of like-minded people who get together, we share memes, we sometimes have a movie night, it's good stuff. And until next time, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to all my Patreon subscribers, the 3 of you that are there. I will consult with you as to whether you want your actual names included in the video for next time. And thank you guys so much for your support, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye everyone!